Okay, now we're going to talk about the preparation of the molds prior to pouring the concrete.
I'm using steel wool to make sure any debris is cleaned off of the steel plates that are going to be touching the concrete. So you want to make sure it's really clean.
And then once that's nice and smooth, nice and clean, we're going to oil and then put the mold together in preparation for pouring the concrete. So we need to oil all of the surfaces inside the mold that will touch concrete. Steel and concrete really like each other and they bond together very well, but we don't want that to happen in a mold. Reinforcement, very good, but here we want to oil everything that's going to be touching the concrete. So we can use vegetable oil, something like this. It's relatively cheap. It's food grade because also we're going to be putting this oil on the mold. Some of it will be transferred to the concrete body, and that's where we're going to be having our water that's being treated. So we don't want it in contact with an oil that is perhaps harmful. So in many places, people will use vegetable oil. They'll use margarine, like Blue Band. Anything that will stick to the steel and prevent the concrete from bonding. We then put the parts of the mold together, lining up the marks on the bottom to make sure we have it the right way around, and then we're going to bolt everything together. So we're now starting to put the oil onto the mold. Alex is using a paintbrush, and we've got the vegetable oil. And we're just applying it so that there's, not so that it's running off of the mold, but we need a good, reasonably thick layer on there. We can also apply it using a rag. We can apply it using maybe even a paper towel, something like that, or a sponge. Put oil on every surface that is going to touch the concrete. So all of the inside portion, all the faces of the external part, here too, and then also inside the nose of the mold. That's really important. That's a place that the concrete can get stuck quite easily. And also the nose plate. We don't oil at this point. It's the top surface of the inside of the mold, because we're going to be using tape to stick the tube, the exit tube for the water, onto this before we pour the concrete. So we don't want oil on here at this point. We'll put the oil on just before we put in the concrete. Okay, so we're oiled, we're ready to put the mold together. So we're going to use this one for a demonstration right now. We're using the version 10.1, which doesn't have the lip to support the diffuser plate. So take the external portion, see, nicely oiled. We're going to move this around, slide it into position. So at this point we've made sure that we're lining up with the marks on the base to make sure that we have the right configuration. We're going to put in the bolts that attach it. We're going to tighten them loosely to begin with, and then we're going to attach the front plate as well. So this will all come together and it will be held together with the bolts. So one thing to bear in mind is that when you put the bolts in, particularly on the base, you want to put them so that the threaded part of the bolt goes down. Because if we put them in the base and they're sitting with the threaded part up, when we come to pour the concrete, it can be quite messy, and then we have concrete that falls and jams up the threads of the bolts. So if they're the other way around, we don't have that issue of the threads getting covered in concrete. So at this point, we can just put the bolts in loosely, just to make sure that everything is lining up well. And now we'll go to tightening all the bolts together. Okay, so we put in all the nuts and bolts, everything lined up really well, and now we're just going to tighten everything in place. So our mold is now ready to move on. It's all oiled, apart from the top plate inside. We've bolted everything together. It's all fitting nicely together. And now the next step is to put in the tube that will convey the water from the bottom of the filter body out of the nose. Food grade, sort of vinyl tubing. So it's a 1/4 inch inside diameter and 3/8 of an inch external diameter, and that works well. The internal diameter allows the water to pass, creates a siphon, pulls the water out of the filter, and the 3/8 outside diameter isn't so thick that it's weakening the wall of the filter body. So we want to cut 41 inches, and that's the distance from this top plate down inside the body of the filter and then out of the nose here. In order to fix it here onto the plate, we can use tape. You can use masking tape, you can use duct tape, you can use packing tape, whatever's available, but it should be sticky enough that it's going to hold the tube in place, but also it should be possible just to pull it off quite easily as well. We've passed the tube down inside the mould, and we've got it coming out of the nose below here, so Alex is holding that. This end we're going to tape to this top portion of the internal part of the mould, because we don't want it to move when we're pouring concrete. We're just going to seal the end of this because we'll have wet concrete in here, and we don't want the concrete going inside the pipe, so we'll just put a little turn of tape on there to seal the end. Doesn't need to be neat. You can leave a little tail, so then when we come to pulling this off, this helps just to tug the tape from the end of the tube. So then we just want to seal it down. So we've used the masking tape here. Doesn't need to be super neat. It just needs to hold the tube in place while we pour the concrete. So the tube's here. It passes down inside and then it comes out the nose. So we're now going to attach the nose plate. We pass the tube up through this hole, and then it holds everything in position while we pour the concrete inside. What's also important is to avoid pulling the tube too tightly inside the mould, because if we pull it too tight, then it's flexible and it will kink, and that will restrict the flow of water once we put it into operation. So we've got our tube fixed. We've passed it down through between the walls of the mould, and now we're going to pass it through our nicely oiled nose plate. So we've passed the tube down inside the mould. We brought it through the nose and then through the hole that we have formed in the nose plate. This is quite a tight fit, and that prevents any of the concrete, wet concrete escaping here. So the nose plate sits right there. We tighten up so it's in position, and then we want to check that the tube is fairly straight inside the mould. So we can adjust the tension to make sure it's not kinked, but to also ensure that it's fairly straight as it passes through the wall of the mould. The last thing we want to do is to cover the hole in the end of this tube. Again, it's just a precaution to ensure that if we do spill concrete as we're filling the mould, it's not getting inside the tube. So we just take a bit of tape and then just seal the end of the tube with that. Some people will use a shaped piece of wood, just like essentially like a pencil, and they'll just pop that in for the duration of the pouring, and then remove them and reuse them. So it saves on tape if you use something like that. We prepared our mould, we oiled it, we put it together, we put it in the tube. And the last thing we need to do is just to give a final check, make sure that everything is in place. And the final thing is to oil the top of the mould inside. If you remember, we left that without oil so we can stick the tube down. And now we're just going to oil this prior to putting the concrete inside. We're ready to go. All the bolts are in place, nose plate is in place, tube's sealed, everything's in place. We're ready to start filling with concrete.